Þetta er mikið hjálp. Já, vanalega er hann eitthvað. Þetta er að þessi reyði.
Takk fyrir því.
Það er að vera batteríslega ságat.
Heyrst þið mér? Já. Velkomin á Hrafnaþing. Þetta er næst síðasta Hrafnaþing vetrarins, 26. apríl hvaða dagur er í dag? 26. apríl er í dag. Og í dag er gestur okkar Stephen J. Hurling sem er doktorsnemi við Landbúnaðarháskóla Íslands. Hann ætlar að flytja erindum Vistfræði nætursjófugla í Vestmannaeyjum og nefnist erindið Novel Methodologies in Tracking and Population Uncovering the Mysteries of Iceland's Nocturnal Seabirds og verður erindið flutt á ensku. Thank you for coming, Stephen, and please take over.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear okay? I think the mic is okay to start. So yeah, my name is Stephen, and I'm just at the end of my second year of my PhD at the Agricultural University. And today I'm going to be talking about my PhD work on tracking and population for the 3 nocturnal seabird species that we have here in Iceland. So what are the 3 species? First, there's European storm petrel, or stormsvölu, which is this tiny little seabird here. Then there's the closely related leeches storm petrel, or sjósvölu, and then the final one, which looks a little bit different but is of the same order, is manx shearwater, or skrofu. And all of these 3 species are petrels. They all live their lives in very similar ways. These are truly pelagic species. They spend most of their life at sea, returning only to land to breed during the summer season. They nest in burrows under the ground, and they're very, very long-lived species. So they might look quite different. As you can see here, these are all birds of the same order. At the top left, you have an albatross, the largest seabird species, and then one of the smallest, the European storm petrel that we have here in Iceland on the right. They look different, but actually there's quite a lot of morphological similarities. For example, you can see here the tube on the nose. I'm going to refer in this talk to these birds as petrels, but you can also call them tube noses. They have glands in their nose to excrete salt, and they also have an excellent sense of smell that helps them locate prey at sea. They also have webbed feet and legs very far back on the body that makes them very well adapted for their pelagic lifestyles. A little bit less so for life on land, as you can see here, as this European makes its way back to the nest. The nest might look a little bit exposed, but this is typical. It's actually inside a crevice in a rock, so it's relatively well protected from predators. Now, these are kind of interesting birds to work with, but why do we care about them? Why am I studying these birds? Unfortunately, seabirds are kind of the most threatened of bird groups. 1/3 of all species is currently red listed. Population for seabirds as a whole have fallen by 70% since the 1950s, and actually petrels are among seabirds the most threatened. So here in Iceland, of the 3 we have, the leeches, the sjósvölu, this is globally red listed. It's classified as vulnerable, so the population has declined by over 30% for the last 3 generations. The other 2 seem to be doing a bit better. So you have the European and the manx. They're currently classified as of least concern. However, they are to some extent like data deficient. There's a lack of monitoring of these species for reasons that we'll soon see. Here in Iceland, all 3 species are on the Icelandic red list, but it's generally because they are range restricted. So what am I looking at in my PhD? There are three aims for my PhD. One is to census Icelandic populations of all 3 species, so how many are there? To check the at-sea distribution. So where do they go throughout the year? During breeding, when they're around Iceland, migration, and over winter. And then also to identify their diet and foraging behavior, again, throughout the year. So I think it's kind of interesting that we're in 2023 and we're in Europe, but for these three species of birds, we don't really know, for the Icelandic populations at least, exactly how many there are, where they go, or what they eat, which are kind of big data gaps to fill. Exciting to fill, but big data gaps to fill. So that's what the PhD is looking at. And the study site is here in Vestmannaeyjum. So we're based on Heimei, but the birds are all on these outer islands that are uninhabited, like Alsey, Brandur, Syðrey, Bjarnarey, Etledey, and so on. These islands are kind of special. They're nationally important for these species because 90 to 100% of the population lives here. And they're also of international importance. For leeches, so the endangered species, for leeches, this is the largest European colony that we have. If you see here, this is Etledey. It might look familiar, it's quite popular, as on Google searches say the loneliest house in Iceland, but that's actually a puffin hunter's hut, and we're lucky enough to be able to stay there and work there during the season. So it's a beautiful place to be based and to work, but it's not without its difficulties. So data collection on the islands is often quite hard. As you can see here, this is somebody walking up on the landing at Syðrey. All the gear that we take to these islands, we have to take with us. All the food, all the water, all the equipment. The islands themselves, it's also kind of difficult territory to work in. Just finding the burrows, the locations for these birds, can be quite tricky as well. But we need, basically to establish the conservation status for these birds, we need good population data. We need baseline data. So we can understand, is the population stable, is it increasing, or is it decreasing? So how do we do that? We're going to look at population first. Unsurprisingly, perhaps given the restraints of working in this environment, population estimates for all three species are incomplete. The main source for population for these three species dates to 1992, which seems like a long time ago and is a long time ago. The recommendation is to survey these birds every generation, and one generation is equivalent to 15 years, so it is long overdue. And also the methods for calculating population have changed in this time as well. A more recent survey on one island from 2018 suggests that for leeches, the endangered species, there's been a fall of almost 50% in the population since that 91 survey. So now there's a need to actually look at all of the islands in the archipelago, because there's probably some difference, inter-island variability in terms of population density, habitat preference. This has been found for these species in Scotland, so we need to check here in Iceland too. Unfortunately, there is not one perfect methodology for looking at population for all three species, so we're taking a mixed approach, looking at playback, capture, mark, recapture, and thermal imaging. And I'll talk a little bit about these. Firstly, for playback, this is kind of the standard methodology for population count. So you go to the field with a speaker, you play a call, and then you listen for a response. If you hear a response, hooray, you know that you have a bird there. We do this during incubation so that we know there's one bird sitting on the egg, so we can accurately count how many breeding adults there are on the island. So if you hear a response, you can tell that there's probably 2 adults there. This is the standard methodology since 2000, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's relatively non-invasive. When you play the call, the bird responds, but it's over quite quickly. It's a short thing. However, the birds don't always reply. Even if there's a bird there, they're not always guaranteed to reply. So the likelihood of the bird replying is dependent upon a number of things. So your distance from the bird, for example, time of day. So if you play during the afternoon versus at night, they're more likely to respond at night. Or even the sex of the call can make a difference. If we look here for the leeches, I'll just play the call. It's quite strange, so bear with me. So that's the female call that you hear repeated. And then there's a pause while we listen for the response, and then the male will call. See if you can hear the difference. It's a higher call, right? So the male actually has a higher call. There was, for a long time, people weren't aware of this difference between the male and the female calls. And the earlier studies, they used the male call only, with the result that the females weren't responding. So the counts were lower. So now best practice is to play the female call first and then the male call second. What do we do with this data? Well, playback is conventional, but this is a little bit new. So we're using something called hierarchical distance sampling. And before, playback would be done in one location, for example, a transect in one area. But now we're trying to look at doing playback across all of the island, the entirety of the island. So what we do is we create this map. You can see the map here is for Etlele, quite a large island. And every 60-meter intervals, we create GPS points to do playback. And with this, that means that we can cover all of the habitat types on the island. And just looking at the map, you can kind of predict where you might find birds. You can see the dark areas. These are areas where there's high puffin density, and probably we can expect higher petrel density as well. And maybe you don't expect too much from the areas that are lighter green. But we can basically check all of this. You can see it's quite a big undertaking. There's maybe 1,300 points to cover an island of this size, which takes a lot of time to do. And also, we need to do repeats, because the bird is not guaranteed to reply every time. So we need to do kind of calibration. So some points we play again, and the next day again, and the next day again, to check how likely is the bird to respond. And also for inter-rater reliability, to avoid bias from ourselves in our listening. Here you can see a very happy, before going into the field, assistant with all the things that we take with us. You can see he's got obviously the speaker, a GPS unit, there's an anemometer to record wind speed, the yellow book for writing down the data, and the map. And on the left, you can see the book itself. So we record the date, the time, and then the distance, how far away these birds were, whether they're male or female, what species, and so on. And from all this, the idea is to create something that looks like this. This is from a paper from like 2012. But we want to be able to create maps for all of the islands in the archipelago that plot the population density for these species. Because every GPS point that we take a measurement, we can get lots of data. So variables such as vegetation cover, also aspects, elevation, those kind of things, and then make predictions for these islands. So this is great and it sounds fantastic. However, for this species, we didn't think that this would work. This is, the habitat types for this species are much more specific. It likes only very rocky areas. It was the cave that we saw at the start, right? So if you have 16-meter intervals, maybe you will miss the habitat completely for these birds. So we need to look at some other methods as well. One way is to do playback at every rock on the island and to make a calculation based on that. Other possibilities are something like this. This is very lo-fi. I don't know if you can see it moving. This is a thermal imager. It's lo-fi because it's just from a phone. This is not the detail that you would get from the camera. But to look actually at the white dots and see where the birds are entering the burrows, and then you can calculate. But there's a lot of man hours, a lot of rewatching video to try and use this method. Another method is simply through doing ringing and recapture. So actually on this island for many years, they've done ringing. So catching birds, putting a ring to identify the birds as individuals, night after night after night, year after year after year. And then from this data, you can get a population estimate or an understanding of adult survival and other stuff. So basically, we're going to use we're using a mixture of methods for population. Let's turn now, once we understand what's happening with the population, we can start to think about why. So if the population is declining, maybe why is it declining? So this is not an easy question to try to answer, just because of how these birds live their lives. They spend time on land, they spend their time at sea, and they travel vast distances. The number one threat to petrels worldwide is from predation. So, for example, cats and rats are an issue, which is why these birds live on uninhabited islands, but also from gulls. And this happens in Vestmannaeyjum. There's a paper from 2019 that showed that approximately two birds per day were being taken by gulls, not by all gulls, but specialist gulls that targeted these species. But it's thought that this is perhaps not enough to affect population change. In Canada, they have the largest, by far, larger number of petrels, Leach's storm petrels. The population has fallen by about 50%, and also there's no big threat from predation. So if it's not happening at land, maybe we need to understand what's happening at sea. For sea, some of the threats include oil and gas platforms. You can imagine if you're a nocturnal bird at night and you see the structure out in the open ocean, it's going to attract. So it can affect distribution for the birds. They can circle the structure, become exhausted, or they can actually fly into the flames and simply be incinerated. Commercial fishing, competition with fisheries is a potential issue. Pollution is a potential issue, particularly with mercury. They found high concentrations of mercury among the Canadian population, which can result in things such as infertility, neurological problems. But once again, it's not thought that it has population level effect. So it's something that's there and present and needs to be monitored, but we're not totally sure of the effects overall. So we need more data. For at sea, we're looking at getting tracking data to map where do the birds go, and then when we know where the birds go, what threats do they possibly face. Until really recently, this was hard to do. So the photo here is from Kvaneri. This is from a friend's master's project where she was using tracking data from Greenland white-fronted goose, and you can maybe see the GPS device on its neck. And this is a 38-gram device, which is quite large. I think it's got solar panels, so it can keep running for a very, very long time. But obviously, that's a 38-gram device, and the storm petrel is a 25-gram bird. So that's not going to work. Until very, very recently, from 2019, for example, in the BirdLife Seabird database, there were only 8 records, only 8 data sets out of 500 for storm petrels. This is 2019. But this has changed. It's changing quickly. So now with technological advances, the devices are getting smaller and lighter. So the ones that we're deploying on our petrels, they're basically less than 1 gram in weight. So what are the goals for the tracking? Basically 2 things. Where do the birds go? And then look at how they are foraging. And the 2 pictures at the top, this is for year-round data. And this goes a device fitted to their leg. The image at the bottom, that's for the summer data, and this is something which is deployed on their back or their tail. So let's look at the results. First of all, for year-round data, we have this for the leeches. This has been ongoing since 2019. So we put the device on the bird for 1 whole year, but if you don't get the bird back, you don't get any data. So if you look at the table at the bottom, you can see 2019, 11 devices deployed, and then the following year, 2 came back. For 2020, 20 devices deployed, and we recovered 4. Then switching to deploying in the burrow, from 2021, we recovered 50%, so it's improving. But these devices, basically, they make calculations on light, so day length and night length, to establish position data. It's not as accurate as GPS, as you can see by the mean error there, but it will lead to results like this. So this is a simplified form for the first bird that we got back. And at the top, you can see this is the bird that's breeding in Iceland, and it spends its winter, tiny little bird, spends its winter all the way down at the south of Africa. And the colored dots, they show where these birds are at each month of the year. For the black dots in April, you can see it seems to spend some time over equatorial Africa. which is not actually the case. Again, because of the nature of the data, there's some cleaning of that data that's required before we process it. When you do start to process the data, you can get this. It looks kind of like a crazy crayon drawing, but this is for all of the birds that we have so far. This is, I think, 15 individuals, and these are the tracks. But we can turn that into this. When we look at what the population is doing as a whole, when we look at what they're doing over winter months, we can kind of see what is their total range and what is their core, the areas that they're using as their core range. So for total area, that's the blue line. That represents about 90% of the data. And then the core use is those red areas. So from this, we can kind of start to see where do those birds go, where do they spend time, and then later we can think about what threats maybe do they face in these areas. Looking at Canada, Canada has been putting larger numbers of trackers for a longer period of time on their birds. And we can see this is for 6 different colonies, all in Canada. The birds seem to be doing the same thing. If we add the data set from Iceland, it's a smaller data set, so it's kind of new, but it looks a little bit different, right, to the Canadian birds. The Icelandic birds, they seem to be traveling further south in winter as a whole. But as I say, this is based on a relatively smaller number of birds, and we're continuing to gather data on this. So this is what they're doing year-round. Let's look in more detail what they're doing here in Iceland. To do that, for the first time ever last year, we managed to put GPS devices on all 3 of these species. So until last year, nobody had too much of an idea about where these birds go. Before the GPS, it's just observations from sightings from ships. The devices that we put, less than 1 gram, we only deployed them for 10 days, and they give a satellite reading every 2 hours. Quite accurate information. Unfortunately, again, it's archival, so if you don't get the bird, you don't get the data. So we put out 30 tags, and we had about a 50% return rate in terms of tags retrieved, which gave us 53 complete trips. So by trip, we're talking about when the bird leaves the nest to go and feed. And here's the data we got for leeches. So these are the mean ratings. For trip duration, 1.7 days. Maximum distance, 171 kilometers. That means the maximum distance the bird traveled away from their nest. Total distance, 551 kilometers. So that means the total distance of the journey from starting the nest out at sea and returning to the nest. And again, it looks lots of colors. Each color represents an individual bird. You can see some areas are clustered and some strange outlier-looking birds. Let's look at one of the individuals. This is it going to go? There we go. And this is one single trip made by one single leech's storm petrel going all the way south to almost Rockall and UK waters during breeding, one single trip. 5 days, almost 900 kilometers, maximum distance away from the nest, and almost a total distance of 2,500 kilometers, which is crazy, right? Really, really long distance for this small bird. We actually think in this case it's probably storm-driven, at least in part. Right now we're just looking at where they went. We're only starting to try to look at why they went where they went. But I think if you just look at the data here from the weather data, it suggests this is potentially storm-blown. And this can also be the reason for the other outlying individuals as well. It gets more interesting maybe when you take all of this data together and look at what the population as a whole is doing. So we can actually work out using hidden Markov models, not only where do they go, but what are they doing when they go there. So we can actually start to identify behavioral states. So it says here, based on step length and turning angle. All that means is, so every 2 hours you get a point. So the distance from point A to point B, if it's a very, very long distance, and if the bird seems to be traveling a straight line, then we can suggest that probably this is a bird in transit. It's a bird which is traveling. If there are very small distances between point A, point B, point C, and there's lots of twisty turning going on, then we can suggest that maybe the bird is foraging, searching for food. So from this, there are three behavioral states that we can classify. And maybe the most interesting one is the intensive search, because this shows where these birds are actually active and they're feeding. So these are the most important areas for these birds. And for leeches, this is the endangered species, you can see that it seems to be moving off the continental edge, and it seems to be feeding in deeper waters. This kind of supports what's happening in some of the Canadian colonies, where the birds are foraging in deeper waters for myctophids that kind of come up at night. But until we look at diet, we won't actually know for sure. For the European, you can see it's wrapped in a little red burrito there to keep it held in one place. It's the same device. This time we put the device on the tail, just taped, using waterproof tape to the tail feathers. So same device, 10 days, archival device, we need to get the birds back. For this, actually for the species, it was quite successful. We put out 16 tags and we got 13 tags back, which gave us 38 trips. So quite a lot of data from this. For the trip duration for these guys, 2.4 days, maximum distance 193 kilometers, total distance 588 kilometers. In each case, it's bigger than for the leeches, but not by much. So it's kind of similar data for these. And again, we can use this to look at what they're doing in terms of their behavior, and focusing in on the intensive search, you can see that it's a little bit different to what was happening before. So here you can see they're active on the Reykjanes Ridge, which is an area that's whales are feeding in, so potentially like euphasids or like zooplankton. Also, you can see it's active along the south coast and also the edge as well. So in shallower waters than the other species. And again, this matches other data. There's a recent paper from Scotland for the same species showing they're also feeding in these kind of shallower waters too. This is probably the highlight of in terms of slides to show, just where you can actually compare the two species and see what they're doing. So these are birds which breed sympatrically, but they're doing quite different things. You can see the segregation quite clearly. If you look at it in terms of the intensive search, yeah, in pink, the European in shallow waters, and the leeches in blue in deeper waters. The last species to look at is Manx, and bigger bird, so we have a bigger tag, which gives us a reading every 10 minutes. Again, archival. This wasn't a great success. We put out 17 tags. We got lots of birds back, but we didn't get many devices back. And I think possibly the reason for that was just our timing was out for when we deployed. Birds were coming back that looked like they'd never had a device taped to them at all, so potentially there were issues with molt, something for us to check for this summer. From these devices, here's a sample of one of the birds. You can see quite quickly it moves north to feed in the waters between Keflavik and Reykjavik. And yeah, I think it spends about 6 days or so feeding in this area, so it's a longer trip than the other birds are taking, but this was typical for the birds that we had. So once again, we can look at the tracks, but also interesting when you compare. So we have the European, the leeches, and the Manx. So if you actually go to Ætlaði, if you're on these islands, you can stand in one place and you can actually see these birds flying at night. You can hear these birds flying at night, all of them in roughly the same area. So on land, they're in the same area, but when they're at sea, they seem to be segregating and doing very different things, presumably driven by prey distribution. So that's kind of the last step, or the next step. Looking at diet, what are these birds actually feeding on? To do this, basically there are 3 things that we're going to look at. One is conventional diet analysis. For petrels, for these small petrels, their only defense basically is to vomit. So if you put mist nets up and plastic sheets underneath, when the birds hit the net, they vomit, and then with a little spoon and a little bag, you can collect their sample, take it back to the lab, and then check it for otoliths, for fish ears, and try to see what their diet is. Another way to get diet is from DNA metabarcoding, so based on fecal samples. And both of these are used to try to understand what these birds are eating during breeding. And we can maybe check, is there a difference between when they're incubating versus chick rearing? But yeah, basically this is during summer in Iceland. What do they eat? Here are two ways to try to find an answer to that. The last thing to check is, what do they eat outside of the breeding season? So when they're overwintering, we can actually use one of the secondary feathers, secondary for stable isotope analysis. And because this feather grows in over winter, you can check again what trophic level is the bird feeding at. So those kind of like the next steps. Okay, so a lot of information there, but we're looking at population, we're looking at distribution, and we're looking at diet. Why? Basically, I think there are potentially some useful conservation implications for all of this work. So the ultimate goal basically is to try to understand, like, what are the risks that these birds are facing. If we don't know where they go or what they do, we can't really understand what's happening to them in terms of their population, why one seems to be declining in the case of leech, but the others seem to be doing okay. We can raise awareness, for example, in forums like this. I think people are very acutely aware here in Iceland of puffin and the issues that are facing them. People are maybe less aware even of the existence of petrels, let alone the fact that they're here and the issues that they're facing. Potentially to propose mitigative action. So if we know there are areas which are key for foraging, and we know that there are some risks, then maybe we can start to understand that and start to make recommendations. And hopefully, this kind of work can in future lead to a reversal in the population declines. But right now, we just don't know. We don't know why the leech's storm petrel is declining and the others are okay. It won't be discovered at all by this PhD, but it will fill in some of the gaps and start to push towards an answer to that. So that, yeah, hopefully we can conserve these species here in Iceland, but also across their Atlantic range. So that's it for me. I'd just like to say thank you, first and foremost, to all of my field assistants. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of hands, in a lot of different conditions to gather this data. Also to the boat captains that take us to and from the island and keep us safe. And also to some of the organizations at the bottom for help with funding for this research. But I'll stop there, and if anybody has any questions, I will try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. First we'll clap, right? Thank you so much. Very interesting lecture. We have some time for questions. I would like you to raise your hand if you have a question and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Kristinn Skarphéðinsson. Thank you, Stephen, for your interesting talk. I was wondering, the birds that you tagged, did you know the breeding status, whether they were incubating or whether did you have any indication of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For example, when we're talking about the GPS, we need to get the device back. And so to do that, we need to know that the bird will come back to the burrow. And so that means when it's incubating, we know the bird will come back. So for example, for leeches, every 3 days they change over. So we know that the bird will come back and it'll be there for 3 days. So when we actually deploy these, we always check basically just by reaching your hand or asking an assistant to reach their hand into a burrow to see, is there an egg and a bird on the egg? If there's a bird but no egg, then we don't do anything. If there's a bird and egg but it's not quite reachable, we don't do anything. So yeah, basically we know that these were all birds that were incubating. One thing that we didn't totally know is the stage of incubation. And I think that's really crucial too, because I think the way that the birds will react to, for example, human interference if it's day 2 after they laid the egg versus if it's day 30 of incubation, probably there's going to be a different reaction there, right? So I think that's something to think about going forward, just how to check that. But it's really like a tough environment to try to find accessible nests with birds that are incubating, but that's the goal. That's the goal. Yeah. Is that okay?
Just another question. You could actually you would check each and every nest for eggs. Is that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you could have taken the egg and made this water measurement.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're like candling the eggs. So I think kind of next summer this summer that's the plan, is to actually check the stage that they're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions? I would like to ask you, because you were talking about risks, we talk a lot about windmills today in Iceland. What about them? Are they a risk for these birds?
Potentially, yes. I think, I don't know too much about this, but my understanding is that in the near future there's going to be like a multi-billion-dollar installation of wind power. I think it's for the UK, but it's kind of like south or southeast of Iceland waters. I haven't actually seen any maps, or maybe you guys know about this more than I do. But again, that's something to consider. And yeah, once we know the distribution of these birds, then we can kind of check against that. Obviously, stuff inland is not going to be an issue, but yeah, so these at-sea installations definitely are potentially an issue. But it's a really hard thing to monitor, right? To see at sea exactly what's going on is a really, really difficult thing to do without a lot of observer effort. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Everything, well, Kristin again.
Well, I'm also interested in, I mean, you didn't tell us anything about the population data. Do you have anything to tease us with?
We'll get back to you on that. Yeah, I think so. For the method that I explained, that data has been gathered for leeches and manx, and yeah, I don't really want to preempt that. So I basically just need to do more work on that. So yeah, for the European storm petrel, we have ringing data for that. Plus, this summer, that's kind of like the main target for population, is to do, for example, traditional playback actually at the colony sites, at those individual rocks, so that we can maybe compare methodologies as well. So looking at estimates that we get from playback, estimates that we get from ringing, estimates that we might get from one of these other methods like the infrared cameras. So yeah, that's work that's ongoing, and yeah, hopefully next year I can say something meaningful about that, but yeah, right now, no. Do you want to use this?
So, no more questions, I guess. I would like to remind you that in 2 weeks, Gunnar Þór Hallgrímsson, professor in zoology at the University of Iceland, hann flytur erindi hérna rannsóknir sínar á uglum á Íslandi. 10. maí það sett. But just give good applause to Stephen again. Thank you very much.